Good morning, everyone. Our reading today is taken from John 18, entitled The Betrayal and Arrest of Jesus. Jesus went out with the disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which they entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, because Jesus often met there with the disciples. So Jesus brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen, came forward and asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am the one." Judas, who betrayed Jesus, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am the one," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again, Jesus asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus answered, "I told you that I am the one. So if you are looking for me, let these others go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that God has given me?" So in our sermon this morning, I mostly want to focus on the last line of that passage. Jesus understood something that we on the path are striving to understand every day. And the confusion is often spoke of, God has a plan for your life. Now, when your life is going poorly, and when you feel you don't know what to do because this situation has not worked out, or you're hoping to date this person and that didn't work out, or your marriage is really difficult and you feel trapped because you have kids, or you're in a job that you just don't know if it's going anywhere, wouldn't it be great to say, "God, what is your plan for me? Let me just do that." And in a sense, there's kind of a take away the responsibility for me to have to decide what to do and just tell me what I should do, and I will willingly do it. Well, in reality, if you were to reach that point, would you be willing to sacrifice your own will? I think that emotionally, it's appealing when things are difficult. If somebody could just say, "This is what you're supposed to be doing, this is the perfect path, this is God's will for you, this is God's plan for you, do it and stop thinking." If that were the case, you would probably have to ask yourself, why do human beings have this incredible ability to make choices on such a subtle level and such a comprehensive level? Why would God take that away from us and say, "I have something specific for you to do. Don't worry about it, it's going to be fine"? God created human beings in order that He may experience Himself expressed through us. And part of the joy, I imagine, is watching every soul come into realization of that, and then seeing what we do. And seeing how we express ourselves and express our godly nature, our divinity, through the vehicle of mind and body and spirit. I mean, for those of you who have kids, is it not exciting to watch your kids create, and the way that they see the world, and the way that they make connections, and the way that they see the world, and the way that they express it? It's exciting because it's different than us, but we relate to it. And it's cute, and it's fun, and it's shocking. So I have come to the conclusion, at least right now, where I am in my journey, that it's not that God has a plan for you that is dictated by God, and you are to surrender to that, and off you go. Well, then people say, well, but in the passage, Jesus says, am I not to drink the cup that God has laid out for me? Okay, well, this is where you have to understand that we as humans, we like things to be very, very regimented. We like it to be like, well, okay, if you're saying that you get to choose your plan, then this line doesn't make any sense. Right, so that's an intellectual interpretation of a scripture. But when you live in reality, you recognize that you may make a choice to do something, and then you go about trying to implement it. And sometimes you hit a wall. You hit a door that's closed. You hit a person that's resistant. Or the opposite. You hit a door that opens. You hit somebody who's very gracious and willing to help you and you didn't expect it. Or circumstances fall in such a way that all of a sudden an opportunity is given to you that it didn't look like it was going to be given to you. So clearly there is our willful decision to move in this direction or to pursue this interest or to explore this opportunity. And then there is the response of, call it the universe or call it God. I prefer to call it God, that God's hand is there in orchestrating that which I have decided to implement. Now, Jesus was very resigned to what he had to go through. Peter, even though he'd heard it many times, could not yet understand and accept that Jesus was going to willingly give himself to the Pharisees, to the religious scribes, to the authorities, knowing that he was going to be basically executed. Peter could not yet embody the consciousness of why Jesus would surrender to that. Let's go back to our concept about, yes, but we as individuals have a huge degree of choice. Imagine now before Jesus came into the incarnation. So he existed on the other side, as we say, as a soul. And I can imagine, though I can't say with utter certainty, that God said, I need somebody to do this rather difficult mission. And here's what's going to happen. And at some point, you're going to have to give up your life in a very painful way. But because you make that choice, I'm going to give this huge gift to humanity. I'm going to create a way for every soul to have a connection with the Christ. And if they accept the mission that you do and believe that it was real, then they can be forgiven of past errors, wipe the karmic roster clean, and begin to live from the Spirit. Who would like to do that mission? So imagine that Jesus said, I'll do it. Okay, so he of his own free will is saying, I want to do that because it's so meaningful to God my Father. And many of us are familiar with wanting to please authority figures in our lives, those whom we feel love us and guide us and care for us and spend time with us and nurture us. When you're kids, you want to please your parents. When you get to be teenagers, you kind of want to please your friends because your autonomy is shifting. But you come back into a place, assuming you weren't too badly wounded by really negative authority figures, you come back into a consciousness of wanting to please that which is higher, that which loves you. So the idea that Jesus accepted the mission, knowing that it would benefit all of humanity, you could see that as a gesture of love to the God who created him and said, I will do that. So when the time came for him to be arrested and go through the hardest part of it, he said, this is the cup that God has laid out for me. So don't get in the way of it, Peter. And especially not with violence. Okay, so how does this play out in our own lives? First of all, can you imagine a time when you could hear God proposing to you a particular mission? On our path, the only way we're going to get there is through learning a process of how to hear that voice of Christ within. And before the Christ within goes, here's how I want you to serve, there are many steps before you would get to that point. And one of those steps would be, do you want to serve God in this life? And if your answer is, I don't know, I'm not sure, then God is not going to say, well, I got a plan for you, so here's what you should do. Because there's going to be too much resistance. And that resistance blocks the movement of love and the movement of the Spirit. It's love that facilitates the movement of Spirit. So if you don't have love for the idea of serving God, then don't try to jump ahead to figuring out what God's plan is for you. I can tell you that God's plan for you is get to a point where you decide what you want to do with your life. Do you want to be a servant of the Most High? Do you want to follow the teachings of Christ? Do you want to come into relationship with the God self, with the Christ within? And if you say, yes, I would like to, then okay, so now we've got a pact with God, because God's like, okay, great, I heard you. So now there is, to a certain degree, a cup that I have laid out for you, and that may be, you got to find a teacher. You've got to surrender to the exercises that the teacher gives you. You've got to face all the things that come up in the way. And that, you could say, that would be God's will for you as you are learning to come into relationship with that Christ. And then later on, once a lot of that turbulence has shifted, and the reason I say turbulence is because for those of you who are in the middle of this process, there are great moments of wonder and excitement when you hear a presence within you, communicating to you from a place of great calmness and great certainty. And it's always the same. When you go into meditation, you find that place, it's always the same. Meaning, it doesn't get riled emotionally. It doesn't get infuriated at this injustice. It doesn't get bummed out because this didn't work out. There is a mystery about that presence, what we say, a peace that passes, a peace that passes all understanding. But we have a mind and we have an emotional configuration, so we may not honor that. We may go I don't know what that is. I don't want to get involved in that right now. Why would I not want to get involved with it? Because it is directing me in a way that might be still counter to where I want to go. So we have to learn, what do we want to do? Do we want to learn how to follow that presence and let that tension subside and surrender to it? Or are we not ready for that? And if we're not ready for that, certainly God is not going to dictate some plan for you. Because to that point, you haven't even demonstrated the trust and the faith in the way that God tries to communicate to you. So it's not going to be helpful if then you try to force yourself to live some sort of mission that you believe God has given you. But let's assume that you say, yeah, I do want to serve God, and I do want to know the Christ, and I do want a teacher, and I do want to be given exercises, and I do want to be accountable to it. Okay, so let's stop there and go, this is part of God's plan for you. You have said yes to it, so now follow through. Follow through with what is asked. In this case, Jesus is following through, and he realizes that when Judas shows up and Judas has betrayed him, that he has to surrender to the authorities and give himself over to the process so that he can, in the next day or so, be crucified and complete the mission, which he knows will benefit mankind in a way that never has been to that point. I want to talk for a moment about Judas, because we know what happened. According to the Bible, Judas was the one who betrayed, and to a certain degree, it is taught as though that was destined to happen. So some might go, well, was that God's plan for Judas? That he would be the betrayer and he was born into that mission? If you read the mystical writings, we often study the writings of Maria Valtorta on our path, you'll see that Jesus tried very hard to communicate to Judas that he was on the wrong track and that he was full with pride and he was full of anger and he was Because of his intelligence, he saw himself as superior to others. And he did not develop that love. And he followed Jesus, at least physically, but he never really surrendered to the Christ. Jesus was trying to prevent him from being the one that betrayed him. Because of his love for Judas, because of his sense that Judas is my friend. I've been living with him for 3 years. And he is about to make a choice to betray the Christ that will have very serious ramifications. And he tried very hard to convince Judas, even at the end, to just go away. Go to some other town and get away from all this. God will figure out a way to get me onto the cross. And Judas refused. Now you could say that it was God's plan through Jesus to help Judas by getting him away from this idea of betrayal. But Judas resisted. He was too attached to what he wanted to do in his mind. He was too angry. So he stubbornly decided to follow through. We realize that there are multiple parts inside of us that create this pressure. There is a Judas part that gets angry at the Christ, gets angry at God because God does not recognize what it is exactly that we want and does not give it to us when we want it. And so then part of us wants to see that Christ in us killed, wants to betray it, wants to express our anger in some way. So we recognize, because the gospel presents a perfect path, a version of the path that is lived out outwardly in the gospel, and we experience that inwardly. So we recognize that we have a Judas part in us that can be angry at God and wants to betray. That is not God's plan for you, to follow that piece. But you have to overcome that temptation through work and through effort and through faith. And then you have the Peter part. Peter loved Jesus, and before they went into Jerusalem in the final year, before Jesus was crucified, he told Peter that you shall be the head of our church. In other words, Peter was the first pope, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against you. And Peter was like, oh no, I can't do that. But Jesus saw something in him. He saw a dedication to the Christ, a love, a willingness to fight to the death. Now that's a little off. And when he goes to attack the guards, Jesus calls him out and says, that's not it. In one of the other Gospels, he says, put your sword away, for those who live by the sword shall die by the sword. In this passage, he says, basically, look, I got to go through with this, so don't get in the way. That's a good lesson for us, because there will be times as you are going through your journey to reach a place where you want to be in service to God and you're learning to understand and communicate with the Christ within, that there will appear as those things that are happening that don't support that. And there will be a Peter part in you that wants to fight against it. Well, this is supposed to go in this way, and I'm not going to let it go that way. The Christ in us is relaxed and might say, are you not to accept the cup that God has given us? Now I would call that advanced spirituality, to reach a point to recognize this battle within. So let's lose the idea that there is a specific plan and God wants you to do, step 1, step 2, step 3, and then you wake up one day and you live in this country and you're doing this service work. And don't bind yourself to something that is going to create constriction inside. Recognize that really the first step to opening to the idea of a plan that God may have for you is, first of all, recognizing that step 1 is deciding you want to have that relationship with God, such that God will support the plan that you have that ends up serving Him and serving humanity. And then you learn to go into meditation and you learn to be nudged and ushered and guided into the thing which turns on your heart and makes you excited. And if it doesn't make you excited, you shouldn't go, well, maybe this is God's plan for me. I don't really want to do it, but why would God torture you in that way? Well, you're thinking maybe, well, Jesus certainly didn't want to be executed on the cross. You know, he didn't focus on that detail, clearly. There were no passages in the Bible where he went, oh my God, that's going to be crazy. He accepted that he had to go through it. Now, I heard that if you are just crucified without all the scourging, that it can take several days of hanging on the cross before you actually bleed to death. And that sounds utterly ghastly, doesn't it? I mean, spending 2 or 3 nights hanging on the cross, bleeding to death slowly. Jesus was spared that agony through the scourging, the intense beating that he took, where a high percentage of his blood spilled out. And so then he only spent 3 hours on the cross. But I'm sure it was probably, some of the worst hours of his existence, just as far as pain and suffering and suffocation. That also helps us understand that in order for certain parts of us to die that are in the way, we have to go through that death process. And I would say that is part of God's plan once you make a decision to do something that is, in this category of service to God. That aspects of yourself will have to die, and that is painful. It might be painful emotionally. It's generally not painful physically, because we are not asked to die physically. At least I've never experienced that. But emotionally, there will be strife. And in this season now, we are a couple of weeks away from Easter. We're finishing out Lent here. There's an intensity as we're sort of moving to the final death rattle of these parts of us that we want to die. So try to resist not. And believe in the resurrection. That following the difficulty, following the strife, following the surrender to whatever difficult obstacle appears, or some step that you have to go through that looks really torturous, that the resurrection waits for us on the other side, that by our faith and our courage, by surrendering to whatever it is, and remembering that we actually said we want to serve God, we want to know Christ, we want to evolve, we want to fulfill a plan that God is behind, then we have to go through some difficulties. But they are temporary. And likely God is trying to keep them as short as possible. It's our resistance that sometimes drags them out because we don't give in more willingly.